year is 1927. In the steamy, disease-ridden jungles of French Guiana, a team of European scientists is engaged in a project so audacious, so ethically bankrupt, and so utterly bizarre that it sounds like something ripped from the pages of a mad scientist's fever dream. Their mission, bankrolled by the Soviet government and spearheaded by a renowned biologist, was nothing less than the creation of a new kind of human, a human-ape hybrid that could potentially serve as a hardy, unthinking workforce. In essence, perfect slaves for the burgeoning communist state. This is the shocking story of Professor Ilya Ivanov, the Soviet scientist who dared to cross the ultimate biological Rubicon in his twisted hunt for absolute control over human evolution. Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov was not some fringe crackpot lurking in the shadows of scientific respectability. He was a highly regarded and influential biologist in the Soviet Union, a pioneer in the field of artificial insemination, particularly in livestock. By the 1920s, he had achieved considerable fame for his work in developing techniques that allowed for the efficient and widespread breeding of horses and other animals. His expertise was seen as a valuable asset to the Soviet Union, a nation eager to modernize its agriculture and assert its scientific prowess on the world stage. But Ivanov harbored far more radical ambitions than simply improving Soviet livestock. He was a staunch believer in Darwinian evolution and was fascinated by the possibility of directly influencing the course of human development. Fueled by the atheistic ideology of the Soviet state and a seemingly boundless scientific curiosity that bordered on obsession, Ivanov began to explore the idea of creating a hybrid between humans and apes. His initial proposal, presented to the Soviet Society of Free-Thinking Materialist Biologists in 1924, was met with a mixture of astonishment and cautious support. Ivanov argued that such a hybridization experiment could provide crucial insights into the relationship between humans and primates, potentially shedding light on the very origins of mankind. He also hinted at the practical applications of such a creature, a robust, disease-resistant, and intellectually simple being that could be employed in arduous labor, freeing up more evolved humans for intellectual pursuits. The idea of a perfect worker, devoid of complex needs and aspirations, resonated with some within the Soviet system, which was then actively seeking to reshape society along materialist lines. In 1926, Ivanov's radical proposal gained official backing from the Soviet government, which allocated funds for his expedition. The chosen location for this unprecedented experiment was the Institut Pasteur in Kindia, French Guiana, where a population of chimpanzees was readily available. Ivanov, accompanied by his son and a team of researchers, arrived in West Africa in 1927, ready to embark on his ethically treacherous endeavor. Ivanov's plan was twofold. The first part involved attempting to artificially inseminate female chimpanzees with human sperm. This was fraught with practical difficulties, not least the logistics of obtaining fresh human semen in a remote jungle environment, and the challenges of safely handling and inseminating wild chimpanzees. Historical accounts suggest that Ivanov and his team attempted to collect sperm from willing, or perhaps unknowingly participating, male members of their expedition. The details of these attempts are murky and often sensationalized, but the underlying intent was clear: to introduce human genetic material into chimpanzee eggs and hope for fertilization. The second, even more ethically problematic, part of Ivanov's plan involved attempting to inseminate human female volunteers with chimpanzee sperm. This aspect of his research generated significant controversy and remains a deeply disturbing chapter in the history of science. Ivanov saw human volunteers in French Guiana, primarily among the local women. The historical record is unclear on the extent to which these women truly understood the nature of the experiments they were supposedly volunteering for, raising serious questions about consent and exploitation. Some accounts suggest that Ivanov misrepresented the procedure, perhaps leading the women to believe it was a form of medical treatment or a standard fertility procedure. The experiments themselves were reportedly crude and unsuccessful. The artificial insemination of the chimpanzees did not result in any pregnancies. The attempts to inseminate human women with chimpanzee sperm also appear to have failed, although the ethical implications of these experiments are horrifying to contemplate. The idea of a scientist operating under the authority of a powerful state, attempting to create a human-animal hybrid through such invasive and potentially harmful procedures, is a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition. News of Ivanov's bizarre experiments began to leak out to the international scientific community, sparking outrage and condemnation. While some Soviet scientists initially supported his work based on a distorted understanding of scientific progress and the potential for revolutionary biological breakthroughs, the ethical implications of creating human-ape hybrids for potentially exploitive purposes were widely recognized as abhorrent. The political climate within the Soviet Union also began to shift. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, the more radical and experimental phases of the early Soviet era were giving way to a more centralized and ideologically rigid system under Stalin. Ivanov's controversial project, with its undertones of genetic manipulation and its potential for misinterpretation by the international community, became an embarrassment to the Soviet regime. In 1930, Ivanov was recalled to the Soviet Union. He faced increasing scrutiny and criticism from within the scientific establishment. The political winds had turned against him, and his once promising career began to unravel. In a cruel twist of fate, the man who had sought to manipulate the very building blocks of life became a victim of the political machinery he had once served. In 1930, Ivanov was arrested amidst a wave of purges targeting intellectuals and scientists deemed ideologically suspect. He was accused of counter-revolutionary activities and exiled to Kazakhstan. His scientific career was ruined, and his radical experiments were officially denounced. He died in Kazakhstan in 1932, a broken man whose audacious and ethically monstrous pursuit of scientific control had led to his own downfall. The story of Ilya Ivanov and his attempts to create human-ape hybrids stands as a chilling example of scientific ambition, untethered by ethical considerations and fueled by a dangerous desire for absolute control. His pursuit of a perfect slave race, a subservient workforce engineered through the manipulation of biology, remains one of the most disturbing episodes in the history of science. While his experiments ultimately failed, the very fact that they were conceived, funded, and attempted serves as a stark reminder of the potential for science to be perverted in the service of ideology, and the profound ethical responsibilities that must always guide scientific inquiry. Ivanov's legacy is a dark one, a cautionary tale of a brilliant mind led astray by a twisted vision of progress and a horrifying disregard for the fundamental principles of human dignity and ethical boundaries. The crowd packed into the lecture hall of the Royal College of Surgeons in London was buzzing with a mixture of morbid curiosity and genuine fear. It was January 18th, 1803. On a wooden slab at the center of the room lay the body of George Forster, a man who, just an hour earlier, had been hanged at Newgate Prison for the crime of drowning his wife and child in a canal. His corpse was fresh, his muscles were still pliable, and the main event was about to begin. Standing over the body was not an anatomist with a scalpel, but a showman with a strange and powerful new machine. His name was Giovanni Aldini. an Italian physicist, and he had promised the people of London a spectacle they would never forget. He was here to raise the dead. To understand the madness that was about to unfold, one must first understand the scientific revolution that was crackling through the air of Europe. A few years earlier, Aldini's own uncle, the scientist Luigi Galvani, had made a world-shaking discovery. While dissecting a frog, he had accidentally touched its sciatic nerve with a metal scalpel at the exact moment an electrical spark was generated nearby. The dead frog's legs kicked with a shocking violence. Galvani had discovered what he called Luigi Cat, animal electricity, a vital life force that he believed was carried in the nerves and muscles of all living things. This discovery ignited a fierce debate. Another Italian scientist, Alessandro Volta, disagreed completely. He argued that the electricity was not coming from the animal, but was being generated by the contact of two different metals. To prove his point, Volta invented a machine that could produce a steady, powerful electrical current without any living tissue at all. The first chemical battery, the voltaic pile. Giovanni Aldini, a passionate defender of his uncle's legacy, saw Volta's powerful new invention not as a refutation of his uncle's theory, but as the perfect tool to prove it on a grand and terrifying scale. He became the great evangelist of galvanism, embarking on a tour across Europe to demonstrate the power of electricity on the bodies of the dead. He was a brilliant scientist, but he was also a master of theatrical horror. He began with animals. In Bologna and Paris, he would take the freshly severed heads of oxen and horses, attach electrodes from his massive voltaic pile, and send powerful currents surging through their dead brains. To the astonishment of his audiences, the dead heads would react. Their eyes would roll, their tongues would loll out, and their jaws would snap shut with such force that the sound echoed through the lecture halls. He was proving that the principle of life, the electrical spark, remained in the body even after death. But animal heads were just the warm-up act. Aldini's true ambition was to get his hands on a human corpse. And in George Forster, the London murderer, he found his perfect subject. The law of the time, known as the Murder Act, dictated that the bodies of executed murderers were to be handed over to surgeons for public dissection, a final, posthumous punishment. Aldini had arranged to intercept Forster's body immediately after his execution. Back in the lecture hall, the performance began. Aldini and his assistants connected the brass rods of their massive battery, a pile of 120 zinc and copper plates, to the corpse. The first application was to the face. As the current flowed, the jaw of the dead murderer began to quiver. The muscles on one side of his face contorted into a horrifying grimace, and, as a contemporary newspaper report described it, the left eye was actually opened. Staring blankly at the horrified men and women in the front row. This was just the beginning. Aldini moved the electrodes to the man's torso. The effect was even more dramatic. The dead man's arm, which had been lying limp at his side, suddenly shot up. His hand clenched into a tight fist, as if he were about to strike a blow. His back, which had been flat on the slab, began to arch with such violent force that it seemed he was trying to push himself into a sitting position. For the grand finale, Aldini decided to apply the full, shocking power of his battery. As the powerful current surged through the lower half of the corpse, the dead man's legs began to kick and thrash. The entire body convulsed on the table with such terrifying energy that it seemed to the panicked audience that the executed killer was about to leap off the slab and run amok. The crowd, which had started with a sense of scientific curiosity, was now completely consumed by primal terror. People screamed. Some fainted. The official beadle of the surgeon's hall, a man named Mr. Pass, was reportedly so shaken by what he had seen that he went home and died of fright a few days later. Aldini, of course, knew he was not actually resurrecting George Forster. He was simply demonstrating, on a grand scale, that electricity could stimulate the nerves and muscles of a recently deceased body, causing them to contract. But to a public that did not understand the science, it looked like a scene from a Gothic nightmare. It appeared to be a battle for a dead man's soul, a fight between the laws of nature and the arrogant new power of science. This performance cemented Aldini's legacy. He became infamous, the man who could make the dead dance. But his work was not entirely without scientific merit. He was one of the very first to suggest that electricity could be used to treat mental illness, pioneering a crude form of deep brain stimulation by applying currents to the heads of patients suffering from what he called melancholia. Giovanni Aldini was a man caught between serious science and macabre spectacle. His ethically horrifying experiments were a crucial, if grotesque, step in our understanding of the human nervous system. But his true, lasting, and unthinkable creation was not a reanimated man. It was a powerful and enduring myth. In the summer of 1816, just over a decade after Aldini's horrifying performance in London, a young Englishwoman named Mary Shelley, who was fascinated by the new and terrifying possibilities of galvanic science, would have a waking nightmare. In it, she saw a pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. From this vision, she would write one of the most famous novels of all time, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Aldini never created a monster, but he gave the world the nightmare of one. He was the twisted doctor who, for one shocking afternoon, took a dead murderer and, with a spark of electricity, truly appeared to have brought the dead back to life. The twin-engine planes of the Imperial Japanese Army flew low over the villages of Zhejiang and Hunan provinces in China. They did not drop bombs. Instead, they released a strange cargo, porcelain containers and sacks of grain mixed with feathers, which burst upon impact, scattering their contents over the fields and rooftops. To the villagers below, it was a strange and confusing sight, but this was no bizarre prank. It was a calculated and diabolical act of war, a horrifying field test. The fleas, now crawling through their homes, and the grain now being gathered by rats, had been deliberately infected with the bacteria that causes bubonic plague. Days later, the fevers would begin. The agonizingly swollen lymph nodes, the buboes, would appear. And then, the dying would start. This was the work of Unit 731 and its twisted commander, Surgeon General Shiro Ishii. Shiro Ishii was not a marginal figure in the Japanese military. He was a star. A brilliant, arrogant, and monstrously ambitious microbiologist from a wealthy family. He was known in his youth for his photographic memory, and his reputation as a hard-partying womanizer. But his true passion was germ warfare. In the late 1920s, he embarked on a 2-year tour of the West, visiting the biological and chemical research facilities of Europe and the United States. He returned to Japan with a powerful and cynical conviction. He saw that the 1925 Geneva Protocol had banned the use of germ warfare, and he concluded that this was proof of its immense power. Any weapon that the great powers of the world felt the need to ban must be a war-winning weapon. And he argued that any nation that secretly developed these weapons in defiance of the treaty would have an overwhelming and decisive advantage in the next global conflict. He began to lobby the highest echelons of the Japanese military, particularly the powerful Minister of War, Sado Araki. He argued that to develop effective biological weapons, animal testing was not enough. To truly understand the effects of these diseases and to create effective vaccines to protect their own troops, Japan needed to engage in human experimentation. The military, fueled by a fervent nationalism and a sense of racial superiority over the Chinese people they were about to conquer, agreed. They gave Shiro Ishii their full backing, a virtually unlimited budget, and a veil of absolute secrecy. In 1936, construction began on his unthinkable creation, a massive, top-secret research and development complex in the Pingfang district, near the city of Harbin, in Japanese-occupied Manchuria. To the outside world, it was known innocuously as the Pingfang Man Spax, Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. In reality, it was a death factory, a city-sized laboratory dedicated to the industrial-scale production of weaponized diseases and the systematic human experimentation required to perfect them. The Pingfang facility was a sprawling nightmare. It comprised more than 150 buildings, including its own railway line, an airfield, and a Shinto temple. It had massive breeding facilities, capable of producing tens of millions of plague-infected fleas per year. It had vast laboratories for cultivating pathogens and production plants for manufacturing porcelain, flea bombs, and, at the heavily fortified heart of the complex, were buildings 7 and 8, the prisons that held the human test subjects. The victims were thousands of Chinese civilians, captured resistance fighters, Korean partisans, Russian dissidents, and even some Allied prisoners of war. They were referred to by the doctors and scientists of Unit 731 by a single, chillingly dehumanizing code word: Madolta, which means logs of wood. This was not just slang, it was a psychological tool. A log is not a person. You can saw it, burn it, and dispose of it without a second thought. And that is exactly what they did. The experiments conducted on the Maruta represent one of the darkest chapters in the history of science. One of the most common procedures was live vivisection, performed without any anesthesia, which the doctors claimed could interfere with their research results. A prisoner, often after being infected with a disease, would be strapped to a table while they were still alive and fully conscious. The doctors would then cut them open, removing their organs one by one, studying the effects of the pathogen on a living system until the victim finally died from shock and blood loss. They did this to men, women, and even pregnant women, in some cases removing the fetus to study the effects of in utero transmission. They systematically infected prisoners with a horrifying catalogue of diseases. They would inject them with plague, anthrax, and gas gangrene. They would force them to eat buns laced with typhoid and cholera bacteria. They would force male and female prisoners to have intercourse to study the transmission of syphilis. Ishii was also deeply curious about the absolute limits of human endurance. Prisoners would be placed in high-pressure chambers until their eyes burst from their sockets. They would be put in giant centrifuges and spun at high speeds until they died. To collect data on blood loss, some were bled to death. Others were deliberately dehydrated or electrocuted. To study the effects of shrapnel, groups of Maruta were tied to stakes in an outdoor testing range, and researchers would detonate grenades and chemical bombs at varying distances. They even used living people as targets to test the effectiveness of new flamethrowers. Perhaps their most infamous series of experiments was their study of frostbite. In the brutal Manchurian winters, prisoners were taken outside and their bare limbs were forced into tubs of freezing water or simply left exposed until they were frozen solid. A guard would strike the limb with a stick, and it would ring with the hollow sound of a block of wood. The doctors would then experiment with different thawing techniques. They would douse the frozen gangrenous limbs in boiling water, or simply observe as the dead flesh rotted and fell off the bone. often down to the skeleton. If a Maruta survived this ordeal, their remaining healthy limbs would be used for the next round of tests. As World War II drew to a close in August of 1945 and the Soviet army launched a surprise invasion of Manchuria, panic gripped Unit 731. Shiro Ishii gave his final orders: destroy all evidence. The massive buildings were dynamited. All remaining Maruta, several hundred of them, were systematically murdered to ensure there would be no living witnesses to their crimes. Ishii then provided his staff with cyanide vials, telling them to take the secret to their graves if they were captured. But the final, most sickening act of this story came after the war. Shiro Ishii and his top doctors, the men who had presided over this carnival of horrors, surrendered to the American occupation forces. They should have been tried for their monstrous war crimes alongside the Nazi doctors at Nuremberg. They were not. In a cold, cynical act of political calculation, the United States government, led by General Douglas MacArthur's Intelligence Division, granted Shiro Ishii and his entire staff full, secret immunity from prosecution. In exchange, they handed over their complete research data, over 8,000 slides of human pathology and volumes of notes from their human experiments. The American government decided that this priceless, gruesome data on biological warfare was more valuable than justice for the estimated tens of thousands of victims of Unit 731. Shiro Ishii never spent a day in prison. He died peacefully of throat cancer in Japan in 1959. The story of Unit 731 is one of the darkest chapters in the history of warfare, a place where scientific genius was completely divorced from human morality. Ishii's twisted mind saw human suffering not as a tragedy, but as a series of data points to be collected. His unthinkable creation was a factory that turned living people into weapons. The ultimate horror of his legacy is twofold: the unimaginable cruelty inflicted upon the gate, Maruta, and the cold political calculus that allowed the men responsible to simply walk away, their horrific knowledge purchased with their silence. He would stand on the train platform at Auschwitz-Birkenau, immaculate in his SS uniform, his boots polished to a mirror shine. As the cattle cars were unsealed and their human cargo spilled out, confused, terrified, and weakened by days of travel without food or water, he would remain perfectly calm, a faint, detached smile on his lips, often whistling a tune from a Wagner opera. This was Dr. Josef Mengele, and this was his kingdom. With a casual flick of his white-gloved hand, he would pass judgment. A flick to the left, and a mother, a child, an old Hain would be sent immediately to their deaths in the gas chambers. A flick to the right, and they would be granted a temporary reprieve of brutal slave labor. But for a select few who caught his eye, especially twins, he reserved a third, more terrible fate. They were to be spared from gas chambers, not out of mercy, but because they were valuable. They were to become the personal research subjects, the living laboratory rats of the man they came to call our Angel of Death. Joseph Mengele was not a reluctant participant in the horrors of the Holocaust. He was a true believer and an ambitious academic from a wealthy Bavarian family. He was a double doctor, holding PhDs in both anthropology and medicine from Germany's finest universities. He was a man steeped in the fanatical, pseudo-scientific racial ideology of the Nazi Party. He saw the Jewish question not as a political problem, but as a biological one, and he believed the science of eugenics held the key to creating a pure Aryan master race. In 1943, he willingly volunteered for service at Auschwitz. To a man like Mengele, the death camp was not a place of human suffering. It was the scientific opportunity of a lifetime. It was a human laboratory with a virtually unlimited supply of test subjects, a place where he could conduct the grotesque and forbidden genetic research that would be impossible in any civilized society. He believed the experiments he was about to perform would make him a world-renowned scientist and a hero of the Third Reich. His primary, all-consuming obsession was twins. To Mengele's twisted scientific mind, identical and fraternal twins were the perfect natural experiment. They were the key to unlocking the secrets of heredity versus environment. By subjecting them to various stimuli, diseases, and injuries, he believed he could finally prove that race and character were purely a matter of blood. Upon arrival at Auschwitz, any twins, especially children, were immediately pulled from the selection line and taken to his special barracks. These barracks became known as the zoo. Here, the children were given an illusion of privilege. They were allowed to keep their own clothes, and their hair was not shaved. They received slightly better food rations than the other prisoners. He would visit them, bringing them candy and sweets. They called him Uncle Mengele. This elaborate performance of kindness was a form of psychological torture, a way to disarm his victims and make the horrors that followed even more incomprehensible. His experiments were a daily carnival of sadism, meticulously documented in his research notebooks. The twins would be laid out side by side on examination tables for hours while he took precise measurements of every part of their bodies, comparing their features. Then, the true horror would begin. He would inject one twin with a deadly disease, like typhus or tuberculosis, and leave the other as the untouched control subject. He would then chart, with cold, scientific detachment, the progression of the disease as the infected child suffered through high fevers, agony, and eventually death. In mild pain. Why would they die? He performed countless blood transfusions between them, often swapping the blood of one twin with the other, sometimes of different blood types, causing excruciatingly painful reactions and fevers. He conducted surgeries without any anesthesia, removing organs and limbs, again, just to compare the anatomy. His goal was often to kill both twins at the exact same moment, usually with a direct injection of chloroform into their hearts, so that he could perform a side-by-side autopsy while their organs were still fresh. One of his most bizarre and infamous obsessions was eye color. Desperate to find a way to genetically engineer perfect Aryan blue eyes, he would conduct excruciatingly painful experiments on the children, particularly those with heterochromia, or two different colored eyes. He would take chemical concoctions and inject them directly into the irises of the children's living eyeballs. The procedure was agonizing, never worked, and usually resulted in severe inflammation, infection, and permanent indiscrimination. We forged our will and our son, and revealed our oncoming graves on the grave. After the experiments failed, the children were murdered, and their eyes were harvested and pinned to a board in his office, like a butterfly collection. His cruelty was not limited to twins. He was fascinated by anyone with a physical abnormality. He tormented a family of performing dwarves, the Ovid's family, subjecting them to a battery of humiliating and painful tests where they were stripped naked and forced to perform for his SS colleagues. He studied children suffering from noma, a horrific gangrenous disease that eats away at the face, a condition brought on by the extreme malnutrition of the camp. He would watch with detached curiosity as the disease consumed them, and then have their heads boiled down to the skull and sent to Germany for further study. He was a man of horrifying contradictions. He could send thousands to their deaths in the gas chambers in the morning, personally torture and murder children in his laboratory in the afternoon, and then return to his quarters in the evening to listen to classical music and read philosophy. He was not a madman in the traditional sense. He was a man for whom an entire category of human beings had ceased to be human at all. When the war ended and the horrors of Auschwitz were revealed to the world, Josef Mengele vanished. He was briefly held in an American prisoner of war camp, but his name was not yet on a major wanted list, and through a combination of luck and administrative chaos, he was released. Using the rat lines, a network of former Nazi sympathizers and sympathetic clergy, he managed to escape Europe. He fled to Argentina and then to Paraguay, living for decades under the protection of fellow fascists and corrupt regimes. He was the most wanted Nazi war criminal in the world. Holocaust survivors and Nazi hunters like Simon Wiesenthal spent their lives trying to track him down, but Mengele, cunning and well-funded, always managed to stay one step ahead. He lived for a time under his own name, a free man, while the children who had survived his experiments were left with a lifetime of physical and psychological trauma. Josef Mengele was never brought to justice. He died of a stroke while swimming off the coast of Brazil in 1979 and was buried under a false name. His remains were only positively identified in 1985. He has become the ultimate symbol of medical evil, the terrifying embodiment of science without a soul. His experiments had no real scientific value. They were the sadistic indulgence of a man with absolute power, a twisted mind who used the language of research to justify acts of monstrous cruelty. His unthinkable creation was a children's medical ward that he transformed into a chamber of horrors. His escape from justice remains one of the most infuriating and tragic postscripts to the Holocaust, a testament to the fact that one of history's most twisted minds was never held accountable for his crimes. In New York City's Central Park, directly across from the prestigious New York Academy of Medicine, a bronze statue once stood, honoring a man hailed as the head, father of modern gynecology. His name was Dr. J. Marion Sims. He was a celebrated surgeon, a medical pioneer who invented the vaginal speculum and developed the first consistently successful surgical technique to repair a devastating and previously incurable childbirth injury. His work, without question, has alleviated the suffering of millions of women across the world for over a century and a half. But the story of how he achieved his breakthroughs, the story of the forgotten women whose bodies he used as his own private laboratory, is a dark and deeply disturbing chapter in the history of medicine. In the 19th century, before the advent of modern obstetrics, a prolonged and difficult childbirth could be a death sentence. For the women who survived, it could sometimes lead to a fate that many considered worse than death: the vesicovaginal fistula. This was a horrific internal injury, a tear between the bladder and the birth canal that resulted in a constant, uncontrollable leakage of urine. The consequences were catastrophic. The women suffered from chronic pain, infections, and a foul odor that clung to them no matter what they did. In an instant, they became social outcasts, abandoned by their husbands, shunned by their communities, and left to live a life of profound shame, isolation, and misery. For an ambitious surgeon like J. Marion Sims, working in Montgomery, Alabama, in the 1840s, this incurable condition represented a monumental professional challenge. If he could find a cure, his name would be immortalized. The problem was, any attempt to do so would require dangerous, painful, and highly experimental surgery. No respectable white woman of the era would consent to being a test subject for such a procedure. But Sims found a solution. In the slave-owning South, he had access to a population of people who could not say no: enslaved black women. Sims acquired a number of enslaved women who were suffering from fistulas, their slave masters having sent them to him in the hope that he could repair them and restore their value as laborers and childbearers. In his own medical records and autobiography, Sims tells us the first names of 3 of these women, the unwilling mothers of his great invention: Annika, Betsy, and Lucy. In a small, crude, 16-bed hospital he built in his own backyard, Sims began his experiments. Over a period of 4 long years, from 1845 to 1849, he subjected these women to a relentless cycle of agonizing surgeries, and he performed every single one of them without the benefit of any anesthesia. At the time, early anesthetics like ether were just becoming available and were being used by surgeons for other procedures, but Sims chose not to use them on his black patients. He held the widely accepted racist belief of the era that black people had a uniquely high tolerance for pain, a biological difference that, in his mind, made the use of anesthetic unnecessary. His own detailed records describe the horror of these procedures. The women, fully conscious, would be placed in an excruciating hands and knees position on a table, a position Sims himself invented to get a better view. They would then be held down, their bodies restrained, while Sims cut and stitched their most sensitive internal tissues, often for an hour at a time. His very first experiment was on a young woman named Lucy. In his own words, he described the 1-hour surgery as extreme, excruciating. After he was done, he had packed her wounds with a sponge to control the bleeding. This led to a life-threatening blood poisoning, and Lucy lingered near death for days. Her agony was so great that, Sims wrote, he thought she would die, but he did not stop. His initial surgeries all failed. The sutures he used, typically made of silk or gut, would inevitably become infected in the presence of urine, and the wound would break open again. But for Sims, each failure was simply an opportunity to try a new technique. For his medical colleagues, however, it was too much. After witnessing the repeated, agonizing, and unsuccessful procedures, they eventually abandoned him, disgusted by the spectacle. For a time, Sims was left without any assistance. So, he devised a new solution. He trained the enslaved women themselves to be his surgical nurses. In a truly twisted and horrifying arrangement, these women were forced to hold each other down on the operating table, providing the restraints for the very procedures that were causing them so much pain. The patient who endured the most was a 17-year-old woman named Annika. She had suffered horrific injuries during a grueling 3-day labor. She became Sims's primary test subject. Over the course of 4 years, Marion Sims performed 30 separate, agonizing, unanesthetized experimental surgeries on Annika, as he slowly, methodically, tried to perfect his technique. Finally, he had a breakthrough. He theorized that using a fine thread made of silver, a material that resisted infection, might work. He fashioned the new sutures himself from a piece of his wife's jewelry. The 31st surgery he performed on Annika was a success. The fistula finally healed. He had found his cure. Having perfected his method on the bodies of the enslaved, Sims moved to New York. He opened the first ever women's hospital and became rich and famous, performing his revolutionary new surgery on wealthy white women. For them, of course, he always used the full benefit of anesthesia. He was celebrated internationally as a medical genius, a hero who had single-handedly solved one of the most devastating female medical conditions. The story he told was one of his own brilliance and perseverance. The names Annika, Betsy, and Lucy, and the years of torment they had endured in his backyard laboratory, were reduced to mere footnotes, their immense contribution and unimaginable suffering almost completely erased from the heroic narrative. The legacy of J. Marion Sims is one of the most complex and troubling in all of medical history. It is an undeniable fact that his work and his inventions have helped millions of women around the world. But it is also an undeniable fact that his success was built on a foundation of profound ethical violation and racist ideology. His unthinkable creation was a life-saving surgery, but it was a creation perfected through the repeated torture of enslaved women who were not given the choice to consent and whose pain was not considered worthy of relief. For over a century, his statues stood as monuments to medical progress. But in recent years, as the stories of Annika, Betsy, and Lucy have finally been brought into the light, that legacy is being re-examined. His story forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. Can a great medical breakthrough be celebrated if it was achieved through monstrous means? It is a chilling reminder that the hunt for knowledge, when untethered from basic human empathy, can lead even a celebrated healer down a very dark path. In the early 20th century, if a member of your family was lost to the deep fog of mental illness, the Trenton Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey was seen as a beacon of hope. Its director, the dynamic and internationally respected Dr. Henry Cotton, had revolutionized the asylum. Upon his arrival in 1907, he had transformed a place that was little more than a human warehouse into a modern therapeutic community. He unchained patients, abolished the use of brutal physical restraints, improved their diets, and insisted on a well-trained, compassionate staff. He was hailed by the press and the medical establishment as a visionary, a man who could cure insanity itself, and he backed it up with data, boasting a miraculous and unheard of 85% cure rate. But behind the progressive facade of this celebrated institution, Dr. Cotton was pioneering a radical and terrifying new treatment, a secret that explained his miraculous cures. He believed he had discovered the single, hidden, physical cause of all madness. And his cure was not therapy, not kindness, not compassion. It was the systematic, surgical removal of his patient's body parts. Dr. Henry Cotton was a man utterly possessed by a single powerful idea. He was the chief evangelist of a medical theory known as Croftis, focal sepsis. At a time when germ theory was new and exciting, the idea that hidden pockets of bacterial infection could cause a wide range of illnesses was popular. But Cotton took this idea to an insane, monomaniacal extreme. He became unshakably convinced that all mental illnesses, from schizophrenia to depression, from mania to anxiety, were not diseases of the mind, but were merely the downstream symptoms of a hidden, festering infection somewhere in the body. The infection, he theorized, released toxins that poisoned the brain, causing the patient to lose their sanity. To Cotton, this was not a theory, it was a gospel truth. And if infection was the cause, then the cure was brutally simple. You had to cut it out. His unthinkable creation was a new, aggressive field he called surgical bacteriology. And it was a horrifying, systematic process of elimination. When a new mentally ill patient was admitted to his asylum, their journey through Cotton's vision of healing would begin. The first stop was always the dentist's chair. Cotton believed that the teeth and gums were the primary portals of entry for the toxins of infection. He established a state-of-the-art dental department within the asylum, and his first order of business for nearly every patient, regardless of their dental health, was the removal of all of their teeth. An X-ray would be taken, and even the slightest shadow on the film would be diagnosed as a hidden abscess, condemning the entire set of teeth to the forceps. But often, after a patient had recovered from the trauma of having all their teeth pulled, they were still mentally ill. To Dr. Cotton, this was not a sign that his theory was wrong. It was simply proof that the primary infection must be hiding somewhere else. So, he would move on to the next likely culprit, the tonsils. The patient, now toothless, would be taken back to the operating theater, and their tonsils and adenoids would be surgically removed. If the patient's madness still persisted, Cotton's surgical hunt for the hidden poison would become even more aggressive and invasive. He believed the abdomen, particularly the colon, was the master sewer of the body, a seething mass of putrefaction that was the true breeding ground for the toxins that poisoned the brain. He began performing hundreds of colectomies, surgically removing large sections of his patient's large intestines. If a female patient's illness was particularly stubborn, he would conclude the infection must be in her reproductive system, and he would remove her cervix, her uterus, and her fallopian tubes. For some men, it was the testicles. One by one, he was removing any part of the body he deemed non-essential. These were not consensual procedures. This was a captive population of the mentally ill, people who were legally powerless and in no position to give or withhold informed consent. The results were catastrophic. Dr. Cotton's public claim of an 85% cure rate was a complete and utter fraud. A lie built on falsified data and a shockingly broad definition of PACE, recovery. A later, independent investigation into his work, conducted by another psychiatrist named Dr. Phyllis Greenacre, revealed the horrifying truth that Cotton had carefully hidden. His surgical procedures were reckless, often performed in a rush. His post-operative mortality rate was staggering. For the patients who underwent the removal of their colon, the death rate was over 30%. For other, more complex procedures, it was as high as 45%. One of the most tragic cases was that of Margaret Fisher, the daughter of a wealthy and influential New Jersey businessman. In 1922, suffering from what was likely clinical depression, she was admitted to Trenton. The full force of Cotton's system was unleashed upon her. First, his team removed her teeth and her tonsils. When her depression did not lift, they diagnosed her with an infected cervix and removed it. Still unwell, they claimed to find a deep infection in her intestines. They performed a series of colectomies, removing more and more of her colon. But the cure never came. The infection, likely from the surgeries themselves, spread, and Margaret Fisher died a painful death. Her father's immense grief and subsequent outrage helped to finally shine a critical light on the horrors that were taking place inside Cotton's celebrated hospital. The most twisted part of Cotton's mind was his complete inability to question his own theory. When a patient died on his operating table, he did not see it as a surgical failure. In his fanatical worldview, it was simply proof that he had been right all along, but that he had tragically not found and removed all of the hidden infections in time. Every success proved he was right, and every failure also proved he was right. He was a medical zealot, a man so in love with his own beautiful idea that he was completely blind to the trail of mutilated bodies and grieving families he was leaving in his wake. Dr. Henry Cotton was not a sadist in the mold of Joseph Mengele. By all accounts, he was a man who genuinely and passionately believed he was curing his patients. But his story is a chilling example of a different, and perhaps even more insidious, kind of twisted mind. The mind of a zealot with a God complex. His unthinkable creation was a system of medical mutilation, a surgical assembly line that dismembered hundreds of vulnerable, mentally ill people in the name of a cure that existed only in his own head. His celebrated legacy is a terrifying cautionary tale about the immense dangers of unchecked medical authority and the deadly, devastating power of a single bad idea. In the late 18th century, the The city of Philadelphia, the proud young capital of the United States, lived in mortal terror of the summer. When the heat and humidity rose, so too did the yellow fever. It was a terrifying and mysterious plague that swept through the city, turning the skin of its victims a ghostly yellow, causing their organs to liquefy, and ending with its most infamous and horrifying symptom, the vomito negro, or the black vomit. As the city emptied out in panic and the dead were collected in carts, one young medical apprentice decided to stay. But he was not there to heal the sick. He was there to prove a radical theory, and his laboratory would be his own body. His primary tool, the fresh, black vomit of dying men. His name was Stubbins Firth, and he was about to embark on one of the most disgusting series of self-experiments in the history of science. In an age before germ theory, the cause of diseases like yellow fever was a complete mystery. The prevailing theory, dating back to ancient Greece, was that of miasma, that the disease was a kind of poison carried in the bad air of the hot, humid summer months. It was believed to be incredibly contagious, spreading from person to person through touch, breath, or even proximity. But Firth, an ambitious and intensely rational, in his own mind, medical student at the University of Pennsylvania, was skeptical. He had made a key observation that seemed to contradict the contagion theory. So, he noticed that the disease seemed to vanish like magic with the first winter frost. More importantly, he saw that the nurses, doctors, and clergy who worked intimately with the sick and dying, who were constantly exposed to their breath and their bodily fluids, often did not get infected themselves. From this, he formed a bold and deeply counterintuitive hypothesis. Yellow fever, he declared, was not contagious at all. He believed it was a disease of overstimulation, caused by the heat and excess which began with the same ravished skies as a summer sun. The problem was how to prove it. He had no modern laboratory, no understanding of viruses or microbiology, so he devised a simple, direct, and utterly horrifying experimental protocol. He would have to try to infect himself. If he remained healthy, his theory was correct. His unthinkable creation would be his own body, which he would systematically and deliberately turn into a human petri dish for one of the deadliest diseases on Earth. He began his series of experiments, all of which he meticulously documented in his medical dissertation, a treatise on malignant fever. His first forays were straightforward. He obtained fresh black vomit, the blood-filled bile from a patient in the final, agonizing stages of the disease. He then took a scalpel and made a series of deep incisions on his own arms and legs. He carefully poured the fresh vomit directly into these open wounds, ensuring it had a direct path into his bloodstream. He waited. Nothing happened, aside from some predictable, minor inflammation. Undeterred, he concluded that the skin must not be the correct route of infection. He escalated his efforts. Believing the disease might enter through a mucous membrane, he collected more vomit and deliberately dripped it into his own eyeballs. He let the fluid wash over his corneas. Again, he waited. And again, nothing. Perhaps, he theorized, the popular miasma theory was partially correct, and the contagion was airborne. He decided to test this next. He took a sample of the black vomit, placed it in a shallow iron pan, and heated it over a fire. As the foul, noxious vapor began to rise, he stood directly over the pan for hours, taking deep, deliberate breaths, inhaling the aerosolized effluence of a dying man directly into his lungs. Still, he did not get sick. Firth was now utterly convinced of his theory, but he was a man of science. He needed one final, irrefutable proof. He had to prove that a contagion was not transmitted by ingestion. So, he committed his most infamous act. He obtained a fresh sample of undiluted black vomit, still warm from a patient. He lifted the cup and he drank it. In his treatise, he calmly noted for the scientific record that it tasted very slightly acid. And yet again, he remained in perfect health. He then went even further in a near maniacal attempt to cover every possible vector of transmission. He smeared himself with the saliva of yellow fever patients. He covered his skin in their fresh blood. He even exposed himself to their sweat and their urine. He tried everything humanly imaginable to infect himself with the deadly plague, and he failed every single time. In the end, Stubbins Firth triumphantly declared his hypothesis proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. Yellow fever, he wrote, was not contagious. His series of horrifying and grotesque experiments had demonstrated this fact. And here is the great historical irony. In a very narrow and technical sense, Firth was absolutely correct. Yellow fever is not contagious through direct person-to-person contact in the ways he was testing. But he was completely, catastrophically wrong about why. The disease is, of course, highly infectious. It is a deadly virus. But it is not spread by vomit or blood. It is a vector-borne disease, transmitted by the bite of an infected female Aedes aegypti mosquito. The true culprit was flying around him the entire time, completely unnoticed. Furthermore, Firth was performing all his experiments on the fluids of patients in the very late stages of the disease, a point at which modern science has shown the amount of active virus in their blood and vomit is actually quite low, making transmission from these sources even more unlikely. He had bravely drunk poison to prove it was safe, and had accidentally survived because he was using the wrong poison. Stubbins Firth's story is one of the strangest and most stomach-churning in the annals of medical research. His mind was not twisted by sadism or a lust for power, but by a zealous, almost fanatical devotion to the scientific method in an age before the necessary tools for discovery existed. His unthinkable creation was a series of experiments so nauseating they are difficult to comprehend, turning his own body into a living laboratory in a display of almost comical scientific courage. He was a man who walked through fire to prove that fire wasn't hot and emerged unscathed through sheer dumb luck. His treatise is a bizarre monument to a bygone era of medicine, a time when the only way to test a theory was sometimes to risk your own life in the most horrifying ways imaginable. Imagine you are 6 years old. You are an orphan, lost and confused in the institutional grey of Bellevue, New York City's massive public hospital. You are told that you are sick, that your mind is broken. A doctor, a woman regarded as one of the world's foremost experts on children like you, approaches. She does not offer a comforting word or a toy. She offers you a machine. This was the terrifying reality for hundreds of children who entered the world of Dr. Loretta Bender. Her twisted hunt for a cure for childhood madness would lead her to pioneer one of the most brutal treatments imaginable, and her unthinkable creation was the weaponization of high-voltage electricity against the developing minds of toddlers. Dr. Loretta Bender was not a fringe quack operating in a basement. She was a giant in her field, a highly influential neuropsychiatrist at the top of her profession. She was a legitimate and respected scientist, famous for developing the Bender Gestalt test in 1938, a tool for assessing cognitive function that is, in various forms, still used to this day. She was seen as a bold and compassionate pioneer, dedicating her life to solving the most heartbreaking puzzle in psychiatry, childhood schizophrenia. But it was her definition of this disease that was so twisted and dangerous. Bender believed that childhood schizophrenia was a rampant, pandemic-level affliction. She saw it not as a psychological issue, but as a biological flaw in a child's development, a plastic, fluid condition that could be diagnosed in infants. Her list of symptoms was astonishingly broad and vague. Children were diagnosed as schizophrenic for exhibiting abnormal muscle tone, for having unusual sleep patterns, for developmental delays, for having anxiety, and even for having a soft, passive body. Her diagnostic net was so wide that it could catch almost any child who was not developing normally. She had, in essence, created a vast population of sick children that she, and she alone, could claim to cure. Her chosen cure was electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. She had seen its effects on adults and became utterly convinced that the powerful, seizure-inducing jolt of electricity could somehow shock a child's disordered brain back onto its correct developmental path. In 1942, with the full backing of the medical establishment, she began her grand and horrifying experiment. The procedure was a nightmare of clinical precision. A small child would be brought into a treatment room. They would be laid on a gurney and held down. Electrodes, slick with conductive jelly, would be attached to their temples. Then, Bendo or one of her colleagues would flip a switch on a machine called the Bender BG-22 convulsive therapy machine, and a jolt of up to 130 volts of electricity would surge through the child's brain. The child's body would go rigid in a tonic spasm, their jaw clenched tight, their back arched, followed by a violent full-body grand mal seizure that could last for a minute or more. In the early days of her experiments, this was often done without modern muscle relaxants, meaning the convulsions were so violent they could cause spinal fractures and broken bones. From 1942 to 1969, Dr. Bender subjected hundreds of children to this procedure. The youngest patient she is known to have treated was just 3 years old. This was not a rare, last-ditch effort. It was her standard protocol. Children would endure courses of 20 or more shocks, often administered on a daily basis. The most twisted part of Bender's mind was her definition of life, success. In her published papers, she wrote with a chillingly detached scientific tone that after the shock treatments, the children became quieter, less anxious, and more manageable. She saw this newfound docility as a sign of a cure. But what was she really observing? Critics and former patients argue that what Bender called improvement was in fact a predictable result of acute brain damage. The children were quiet, not because their illness was gone, but because they were suffering from the known side effects of massive electrical trauma. Proven, permanent memory loss, a state of deep confusion, and a terrifying, learned helplessness. They were easier to manage because they had been terrorized into submission. One of her most vocal survivors, a man named Ted Chabasinski, was institutionalized at the age of 6 and diagnosed as schizophrenic by Bender herself after she observed that he would rock back and forth. He was subjected to a course of 20 shock treatments. He later dedicated his life to activism against psychiatric abuse. Of his experience, he said, "You don't have a memory of the shock itself. I have a memory of waking up. But you have a memory of the gurney. You have a memory of the people holding you down." It was a frightening and confusing experience. It wiped out a lot of my childhood memories. It is a terrifying thing to do to a child. Bender's experimentation on the minds of children was not limited to electricity. In the 1960s, as psychedelic research became a new frontier, she began a series of studies where she gave hallucinogenic drugs, including LSD, psilocybin, and mescaline, to both her schizophrenic patients and to normal children as young as 7. Her stated goal was to induce model psychosis, to temporarily make healthy children insane so that she could better understand the nature of insanity itself. The ethical lines were not just blurred, they were completely erased. Dr. Loretta Bender was celebrated for much of her long and influential career. She was seen by many as a fearless pioneer, a doctor willing to use extreme methods to tackle the most intractable problems in child psychiatry. But her legacy is now viewed through a much darker lens. She is a terrifying example of a mind so consumed by its own theories that it becomes blind to the human cost. Her unthinkable creation was not just a treatment, but a diagnostic philosophy that labeled countless difficult, different, and traumatized children as schizophrenic, thereby justifying their submission to her brutal experiments. Her story is a profoundly disturbing look into the dark history of psychiatry, a cautionary tale about the immense danger of a doctor with a radical theory, absolute authority, and a steady supply of vulnerable children, trapped inside a system that was supposed to be healing them. In a sparse Moscow laboratory in 1954, a creature that should not exist was lapping milk from a bowl. It was a large German shepherd, but sprouting grotesquely from its neck, just in front of its shoulders, was a second, smaller head. The head and forelegs of a puppy. The second head was alive, its eyes were alert, its own pink tongue eagerly lapping milk from a separate bowl. This was not a hoax, nor a creature from a nightmare. This was a surgical reality, the unthinkable creation of a brilliant and obsessive Soviet surgeon named Vladimir Demikov. He had successfully performed a head transplant, creating a living two-headed dog. And it was just one of more than 20 such creatures he would bring into the world in his relentless and ethically terrifying quest to prove that any part of a living organism, including the seat of consciousness itself, could be transplanted. To understand the twisted mind of Vladimir Demikov, you must first understand that he was not a simple mad scientist. He was, without question, one of the most important and tragically overlooked pioneers in the history of transplant surgery. In a world before the heart-lung machine, before immunosuppressant drugs, Demikov was a visionary, a man whose surgical skill was decades ahead his time. Working in a poorly equipped lab, insulated from the West by the Iron Curtain, he was performing medical miracles on animals. In 1946, he performed the world's first successful coronary artery bypass surgery on a dog, a procedure that would eventually become one of the most common life-saving operations for human beings. In that same year, he performed the first successful heart-lung transplant on a dog, which lived for several days. A year later, he transplanted a lung. A few years after that, a liver. Many of the fundamental techniques he invented for connecting major blood vessels are, in modified form, still used in operating rooms around the world today. He was, in many ways, the true father of modern transplantology. But his ambition went far beyond transplanting individual organs. He had a much grander, more audacious, and more horrifying goal. He saw the head as the ultimate challenge. The head contained the brain, the very center of identity, personality, and consciousness. He theorized that if a surgeon could successfully transplant a living head onto another body while keeping it alive and conscious, it would be the ultimate proof of surgical mastery. If you could transplant a head, then transplanting any other organ, like a heart or a kidney, would be proven to be comparatively simple. The two-headed dog was to be his definitive proof of concept. The surgical procedure he developed was a marathon of breathtaking complexity and ruthless efficiency. He would take two dogs, a large, healthy host dog, and a smaller donor dog, often a puppy. The surgery would begin with the donor. Demikov would amputate the puppy's lower body, leaving only its head, shoulders, and front legs. But in a feat of surgical genius, he would carefully preserve the puppy's heart and lungs, keeping them connected and functioning for a time to keep the brain oxygenated. He would then make a long incision in the neck of the larger host dog, exposing the jugular vein and the carotid artery. With meticulous, almost artistic precision, he would begin to connect the blood vessels of the two animals, using special stapling devices he had invented himself to suture the puppy's arteries and veins to the circulatory system of the host. Finally, he would attach the puppy's severed spine to the spine of the larger dog and sew the skin and tissues together, leaving the second head in its paws, resting on the larger dog's back. The entire operation could take over 3 hours. The result was a grotesque, surreal, and scientifically astonishing creature. A single, living body with 2 independently conscious heads. Film footage from his laboratory, which was later used as both a scientific document and a piece of Soviet propaganda, shows the bizarre reality of these animals. Both heads were alive and aware. The larger host head would move around, while the smaller, grafted head would look around the room, yawn, and even bark at the lab assistants. The grafted head retained its own distinct personality. When it was offered milk, it would drink eagerly, the milk then dribbling out of a disconnected esophageal tube onto the floor. The footage captures strange, unsettling moments of interaction. The host head sometimes tried to shake off the new head as if it were an annoying parasite, or the grafted head playfully biting the larger dog's ear. But the success was always a temporary and cruel illusion. These surgically conjoined animals were living in a state of immense suffering and confusion. Demikov was a master of the physical act of surgery, the plumbing and the wiring, but he had no solution for the great, unsolved biological problem of his era: tissue rejection. The host dog's immune system would inevitably identify the second head as a foreign entity and launch a massive, overwhelming attack against it. All of his 22-headed dogs died. Most perished within a few days. The longest surviving creature, a dog he named Pirat, lived for only 29 days before its body finally rejected the second head. When one of his creations died, Demikov would simply procure more dogs from the local pound and try again, relentlessly refining his technique. When news of his experiments first reached the West, it was largely dismissed as but a grotesque Soviet hoax. The homemaker, O. Lenin, proved his face, but as more detailed reports and, eventually, the chilling film footage emerged, the international medical community was forced to take notice. While horrified by the ethics of his work, surgeons around the world were stunned by his technical skill. In the 1960s, a promising South African surgeon who was dreaming of performing the first human heart transplant made 2 separate trips to Demikov's drab Moscow laboratory. His name was Christian Barnard. He watched Demikov's procedures firsthand and later wrote that if Demikov was not a charlatan, then he was a surgical genius. Barnard would later openly acknowledge that Demikov's pioneering work on heart-lung transplantation in dogs gave him the knowledge and the courage to attempt his own world-changing operation on a human being. Vladimir Demikov's legacy is a profound and unsettling paradox. He was a visionary surgeon whose pioneering techniques unquestionably paved the way for the life-saving human heart and lung transplants we have today. Yet, he is most remembered for his most monstrous and famous creation, the 2-headed dogs. His story is a powerful and uncomfortable exploration of the ethical gray zones of scientific progress. It is a testament to a twisted mind so focused on the scientific question of Can we do this? That he never stopped to ask the moral question, should we? He was a brilliant monster, a man whose grotesque experiments on animals helped to create one of modern medicine's greatest miracles for humans. In 1932, in the heart of the Great Depression, an incredible offer was made to the poor, black sharecroppers of Macon County, Alabama. The United States government itself, through its public health service, was offering them something they had never had: free medical care. The flyers promised free physicals, free rides to the clinic, hot meals on examination days, and even a handsome sum of $50 for burial insurance. For these men, many of whom had never seen a doctor in their lives, it seemed like a miracle. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a vague local term for a host of ailments. This was the first and the most important of many lies. The men were not being treated. They were the unknowing subjects of a secret 40-year experiment, a study designed to do nothing more than watch and meticulously document as a terrible disease, syphilis, slowly and agonizingly destroyed them from the inside out. God. The twisted mind behind this experiment was not a single mad scientist, but the cold, institutional mindset of a government agency steeped in the scientific racism of the era. The formal name of the experiment was MORE, the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. It was born from a desire to study the full, long-term progression of the disease, and it was built upon the racist and unproven assumption that syphilis affected black bodies and minds differently than it did white ones. The original study was only supposed to last for 6 months to a year. It would end up lasting for 4 decades, becoming a byword for medical malpractice and ethical corruption. The researchers enrolled 600 men. 399 of them had latent syphilis. The other 201 were a healthy control group. The entire project was a masterclass in deception. To gain the men's trust and ensure their continued participation, the researchers hired a local African-American nurse named Eunice Rivers. Nurse Rivers became the crucial link, a familiar and trusted face who ferried the men to and from their appointments and assured them they were receiving the best care. The treatments they were given were a cruel sham. They were given useless placebo pills, like aspirin and mineral supplements, and told it was their medicine. The painful and sometimes dangerous diagnostic spinal taps they were subjected to, which were done purely to collect data for the researchers, were pitched to them as a special. Jokes, last chance, free treatment. The men believed they were being healed. In reality, they were being observed like specimens in a jar. But the most monstrous part of the experiment was not the initial deception, but the deliberate, conscious decision that came years later. When the study began in 1932, there was no reliable cure for syphilis. But by 1947, a medical miracle had become widely available: penicillin. It was a cheap, safe, and highly effective cure for the disease. The doctors of the Tuskegee study now had a profound moral choice to make. They could end their experiment, treat the 399 infected men with this miracle drug, and save them from the devastating long-term effects of the disease. Or they could continue their study, pretending the cure did not exist, and watch as the disease ran its natural, brutal course. They chose to continue. The officials at the Public Health Service, in collaboration with the Tuskegee Institute, made a secret and unanimous decision to withhold the cure. Their scientific curiosity, their desire to see their experiment through to its morbid conclusion, was deemed more important than the lives and health of 399 black men. The study now transitioned from being merely unethical to being actively malevolent. The researchers took aggressive steps to ensure their subjects never received treatment from any other source. They provided local doctors in Alabama with a complete list of the men in their study and explicitly instructed them not to treat them for syphilis. When some of the men were drafted into the US Army to serve in World War II, the study's organizers intervened. They secretly provided the draft board with a list of their names to ensure they would be excluded from military service, because a standard Army induction would have included a blood test and a mandatory dose of penicillin. They were trapped inside the experiment, their only escape being the grave, which the study had so generously offered to pay for. For 40 years, the government doctors watched. They took notes, they drew blood, and they published more than a dozen scientific papers in prestigious medical journals, all while their subjects suffered and died. They coldly and meticulously documented the devastating long-term effects of untreated tertiary syphilis. The men went blind, they went deaf, they developed cardiovascular disease, crippling bone deformities, and severe mental health problems as the syphilis attacked their brains and central nervous systems, leading to insanity. And the tragedy did not end with them. Dozens of their wives contracted the disease, and at least 19 of their children were born with congenital syphilis, a devastating condition passed down to them because their fathers were denied a simple shot. The study finally came to an end, not because the Public Health Service grew a conscience, but because a single, courageous whistleblower decided he could no longer stay silent. In the late 1960s, a PHS venereal disease investigator in San Francisco named Peter Bacton learned of the ongoing study and was horrified. He lodged formal ethical complaints with his superiors, but he was told that the study was not to be stopped. After years of being ignored, Bacton leaked the story to an Associated Press reporter named Jean Heller. On July 26, 1972, Heller's story was published on the front page of the New York Times. The public outrage was immediate and immense. The 40-year lie was finally over. By the time the study was shut down, only 74 of the original 399 infected men were still alive. At least 128 had died either directly from syphilis or from related complications. In 1997, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology to the handful of elderly survivors, but the damage was done. The Tuskegee study is one of the most infamous and shameful episodes in the history of American medicine. The unthinkable creation was not a monster or a machine, but a 4-decade-long lie. A living laboratory where doctors, sworn to do no harm, actively and knowingly allowed their patients to suffer, decline, and die for the sake of their research. The legacy of this betrayal is a deep and entirely justified mistrust of the medical establishment within the African American community, a scar that still affects public health to this day. It is the ultimate and most chilling story in our series, proving that the most twisted minds are not always found in mad scientists, but can exist within the quiet, respectable, and bureaucratic halls of a trusted government institution. From reanimated corpses to two-headed dogs, we have journeyed into the laboratories of history's most twisted minds. These stories are a chilling reminder that the noble pursuit of knowledge, when stripped of all morality, can create monsters far more terrifying than any fiction. Which of these forbidden experiments was the most disturbing to you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this journey into the dark side of science compelling, be sure to like this video and subscribe for more.